Crony Capitalism and Environmental Sustainability. Is current economic and social progress created by neoliberal globalization sustainable? If we were to look at the first decade of neoliberal globalization from 1995 to 2004, what we would see is that there was tremendous investment in the developing world, more jobs, higher wages, less malnutrition. So what we see is, in a way, the diffusion of prosperity, whether it's Middle or Eastern Europe, Latin America, Southeast Asia, a little bit less so in Sub-Saharan Africa. But if we would take a deeper look, one of the things that we would notice is that much of this growth was also connected to another factor, which might not be fundamental, but more contingent, and that was higher commodity prices. The opening of the global economy came at the right time for Western industries that were running out of resources in their own neck of the woods, and who were finding the restraints of post-colonial states that established high tariffs. So one of the things powering the big commodities boom is that on average, many Western resource companies, miners like Barrick Gold or Freeport McMoran or Marathon Oil, expanded, bought out many of the extractive industries in the developing world, so that today most of these economic sectors, rather than being owned by the state or local entrepreneurs, are now owned by multinational corporations whose shareholders are disproportionately in Western countries. Now, as I've noted before, one of the interesting things about looking at these statistics from, say, 1995 to 2005 or even 2015 is that there's been a dramatic reduction in global poverty as well as malnutrition. At the same time that this has been happening, there's been also a widening of the gap between the very rich and the very poor. So how do we explain this dynamic? Looking at the extractive industries in the developing world provides us with one important clue as to what is going on. One of the things we noted about neoliberal globalization is that the losers and winners are very complex to score in a very simplistic way. In general, subsistence farmers have lost because they couldn't compete in a global marketplace. So how can it be that wages have gone up and that malnutrition's gone down? Well, it's very easy. Now, essentially, consumers in the developing world had access to the global market and more efficient production. So they had access to consumer goods, including food, at lower prices. This is the iron law of the market. However, one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is whether these relative benefits, because certainly farmers that lost their land and livelihood were not beneficiaries, are these trends sustainable over the longer run? To understand whether developing world economics is sustainable, whether prosperity is going to be temporary or beneficial of a longer-term trend where the developing world will catch up to the West, we need to dig down into the extractive industries, whether it's mineral resources or timber resources or oil resources. Most of these resources were acquired by very wealthy capitalist concerns, multinational corporations, Western banks, Western investors, mutual funds, etc. To understand whether this is sustainable, we have to look at how these resources are purchased, consumed, harvested, and brought to the market. And one of the things that we see is that the system is generally based on what we call the concession system. So whether you're mining for copper or whether you're harvesting timber, the way it typically works is that a company like Freeport McMoran will go to the Indonesian government, and they'll purchase the right to extract a particular resource over a territory over a limited part of time. Now, ideally, in a free market system, this resource would be sold at the real value, so that the profits to be made by the corporation would come, but the profits and the royalties paid to the country would be sufficient to replenish the resource and also provide development for schools and hospitals for the local community. But if you look at these actual contracts or these deals, what you see is that corporations like SNC-Lavalin are not exceptional, but the general rule. There's a lot of bribery that takes place, where essentially Western corporations cut backdoor deals with presidents or ruling elites or sons-in-laws or resource ministers, and often there's a criminal syndicate at the top of the state, and the money from these foreign corporations goes all in these pockets. So rather than this money coming into the treasury and benefiting the development of the state and its developmental priorities, a lot of it's ending up into private pockets. There's another problem with this system as well. The concession system fundamentally is not a system which is designed to promote ecological sustainability. You don't own the land. You don't have a longer-term stake in the health of the resource. You only have the right to extract these resources for a limited period of time, say a year, 5 years, maybe 10 years. That is your concession, the concession by the state. So if you're a for-profit corporation, what you want to do is to extract the timber as easily as possible, as cost-effectively as possible. This is going to increase your profit. So if you're going and you have a timber concession in the Amazon, and you're looking for teak trees, and there's only 1 per 1,000 trees that are teak, and your sawmill isn't set up for other timber, what you're going to do is you're going to clear cut the whole forest to get to those logs that you can actually make money from. Now, this might be a very bad ecological decision. It might destroy the rainforest. It might create erosion, and eventually it will wash away the soil, and it will cause land degradation that might last 50,000 years. It's a very poor management decision, but you don't own the land. The only thing that you own is a license to extract the resources. So the logic of the system will dictate that you get your cash fast rather than making decisions to preserve the resource over the longer run. So what we see is that the way the world economy actually operates, especially with many states that are in debt and have to pay money back to Western banks, is that they need to sell concessions to these corporations in order to service their debt. They often get illegal kickbacks that might not be benefiting the average citizen, but does benefit them personally. And that any attempt to regulate this exploitation, for example, the rainforest, for how many decades have been talking about, the air boreal, how we're cutting down the rainforest, how this is completely illogical, that it's contributing to climate change. But it nonetheless goes on because it reflects not only the logic of the market, but it also reflects the structure of the concession system. It's a system that profits connected elites in developing countries, corporate investors, and to a certain degree Western consumers. And the losers are people that actually live on the land and local taxpayers that maybe get a short-term boost in terms of jobs and higher wages, but over the longer run are facing massive ecological deterioration. Once the rainforest is gone, it's not going to come back, and the value and the livelihood that could have been sustained there will have been exhausted. Now, if we think about the concession system on a global scale, one of the things that we see is that since 1995, the deterioration of the biosphere has dramatically escalated. So this shouldn't surprise us if we understand that Western capital has controlled these extractive industries, they've intensified production, and they haven't used ecologically sound principles. This is fully understandable, but we're now in a situation where ecologists that try to measure this level of ecological deterioration say that we're at overshoot. We're at about 140% overshoot. That means that the resources that the earth provides, we've exceeded that. So that means that we can harvest wood from the Amazon rainforest, and we can get a benefit from it, but at the cost of permanently damaging the ecosystem. Or we can farm the Central Valley of California, but only at the cost of exhausting the aquifer, the freshwater resources, and once they're gone, the land's going to turn into a desert. So we can keep our growth going for the short run, but only at the cost of overexploiting the resources so that we're ensuring that our resource base will be less in the future. So this raises a fundamental question about whether neoliberal globalization is viable over the longer run. And what we see is that not only has ecological deterioration increased since 1995, it's dramatically escalating so that by the end of the century, even by the half century, 2050, our consumption will be about 3 Earths. And this makes sense if you think about it. I mean, in 1970, China had a standard of living that was basically on par with most areas of sub-Saharan Africa. Now there's 300 million people living in China that have a level of consumption that's similar to Canada. So who's going to provide for this level of consumption for Indian middle class, the Chinese middle class? Well, obviously, it's going to take more resources, and to extract these resources is going to cause more ecological harm. As these resources are extracted, we're going to see more pollution, more land degradation. It's going to lead to a grimmer future for people in the future, particularly people living in developing countries, countries like Brazil, that will inherit a deserted landscape once the rainforest has been cut down. So neoliberal globalization has inspired intense debate. The boosters argue that economic growth is spread, and as wealth goes to countries like Brazil, and they take care of their basic needs, they'll start to use the resources more wisely, and they'll develop and basically catch up to the West and have a similar standard of living. And there's of course some evidence for that, at least over the short run. The critics of globalization argue, particularly environmental critics, that this growth is not sustainable. So I wanted to present this question to you. What is your sense about the future of the world economy? Will Canada's standard of living continue to increase, or will these ecological deteriorations start to make an impact on Canadian living standards? Will you have the same standard of living as your parents, or will it be less? So if we're going to draw a few conclusions, one of the things that we have to note is that since 1995, one major change in the global economy is that many of the resources that were in the developing world, which were previously owned by local investors or in various ways protected by tariffs, these were removed, and this enabled Western multinationals to take control over what we call the extractive industries. Now, in general, this move was economically beneficial over at least the short run. It's created a lot of investment, increased production. This brought jobs. But it was already apparent that this development of these resources also came at a high ecological price. One reason is the concession system, which doesn't provide any incentive for environmental conservation. And when we look at the ecological overshoot, this leads us to be concerned about the future. Although wages are generally higher and malnutrition has gone down, it doesn't seem to be something which is going to be sustainable over the longer run in an economy where natural resources are overexploited, causing permanent, long-term, irreparable damage to the resource base. Once the forest is cut down, once the coral reefs are destroyed, once the fresh water is exhausted, the future generations are going to have to make do with a depleted resource base.